welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and let's talk about certain cards that I think are really important in the format. And of course, that's a very broad term, but what does that exactly mean? It means cards that are sort of mechanically unique in what they're doing, particularly in the colors that you are in, right? Because of course, in the Commander format, color identity is so important. So certain cards doing certain things in those colors can be really, really important. And as a deck builder, right? This is a deck building strategy sort of video because whenever you're building a deck, you're looking to do certain things. And again, particularly in the colors that you're building. So there are very important cards that you should take note of, right? And as a deck builder, I have committed a lot of these cards to memory because as I've built decks, I come across these cards and I'm like, okay, well, there's a very unique card in that color that is doing a very specific thing that if I'm going to build a deck like that later in the future, I take note of that card and know that it exists because it is either the only card that does that or it's the best choice for doing something like that. I started doing this last year when I came across Phoenix Chick, and that's one of these cards, a card that doesn't really look like much. 1 red mana, Phoenix 1/1 flying haste, can't block. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, you may pay 2 red. If you do, return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attack with the +1/+1 counter on it. It's a pretty good creature. I guess you could put it in any aggro strategy. Why this card is entirely unique and really important, I think, in a lot of decks is because it is a 1 mana flying haste creature. That's why I took note of this card. Again, as a deck builder, when I see a card like this, I catalog it in my memory so that going forward, I always remember it whenever I'm building a deck where I need a creature with flying and haste that I want to, of course, get out right away because this only costs 1 mana. Up until this point, when this card was printed, there has never been a 1 mana flying haste creature. Now, why do you want flying and haste? Because of flying, of course, is one of the best ways to get evasion. So if you have any deck that is wanting attack triggers, and of course, in red, there's a whole bunch of decks like that, this is a great option. Just a 1 mana card that comes down and immediately gives you that attack trigger. And also, because it's got flying, you probably don't have to worry about it dying. Also, though, if you have any deck where you want to be getting in for damage, it's a phenomenal include there. 1 mana comes down, and again, it's very likely that I'm going to have at least one opponent that doesn't have a flying blocker, and I can immediately get in for damage. So it's a really notable card for that reason, even though it might not seem like much, right? I bring up cards all the time on my channel like Pull from Eternity or Rift Sweeper, right? These are cards that mechanically unique in what they're doing. These two cards are sort of doing the same thing, right? Pull from Eternity is taking a card from exile and putting it back into your graveyard. Fantastic if you're like in an Oscar deck, right? Any deck where you're repeatedly exiling stuff from your graveyard. But again, it's one of the only ways to actually get something out of exile once it's been exiled. Rift Sweeper, same thing, right? Rift Sweeper is going to take something you own from exile and shuffle it into your library. So if you have a very important card that has gotten exiled that you want back, this is one of the few rare ways that you can actually get it. And again, extra good in, say, a Sisay deck where you can actually search for things, right? So if I have a legendary card that has been exiled, now I can Rift Sweeper, shuffle it back into my library and go get it immediately with my Captain Sisay, right? So extra good in decks like that. These cards are very, very important in the Commander format because they are doing something very unique that could be really, really important in certain strategies. I talked about Panglacial Worm recently. There's a card that is doing something entirely unique. No other card in the game of Magic is doing this. You can cast it from your library while searching. And again, that's another card that I have committed to memory. I mean, because it's really unique, but also because, again, if I'm in that Captain Sisay deck, there is a commander that can repeatedly be searching my library. So later in the game, I got a bunch of extra mana lying around. This essentially becomes tap my commander and I get to cast my Panglacial Worm from my library, right? So as I talked about in that, I think that 5 cards video I did, there's a creature that you sort of have in the back of your mind whenever you're deck building. And if you happen to be building a deck that is repeatedly searching all the time, that's a very easy card to slot in that maybe I can just cast later on and I got a 9/5 Trampler that can help me close out the game. I also talked about Soul Sculptor in a 5 cards video recently. Very unique card. There's no other card like it. 2 and a white, human, 1/1. Pay 1 and a white and tap. Target creature becomes an enchantment and loses all abilities until a player casts a creature spell. So there's just a whole bunch of ways to use that ability. It's a very unique ability, entirely unique, right? right? You're turning a creature into an enchantment. Of course, you can use it on your opponents. You can use it on yourself. Not going to fit in a bunch of decks, but because it's doing something super, super unique, it's good to commit this sort of card to memory so that if you happen to be making a deck like that in the future, now you know, hey, this is going to be a perfect fit in the strategy I'm doing, right? Xenic Poltergeist is another card similar, where it's a black card that is turning artifacts into creatures. 1 black, spirit 1/1. Tap until your next upkeep. Target non-creature artifact becomes an artifact creature with power and toughness, each equal to its mana cost. And of course, we've all seen this ability before, but typically we see it in blue, right? Blue does this ability a lot. I guess colorless does this ability a lot as well. This is the one black card that's doing it. For me, this is a very important card to commit to memory because even though it might not seem like it, this is a card that can very easily shoehorn into a lot of decks. Black's not great at dealing with artifacts, but it is fantastic at dealing with creatures. So if I'm in any mono black deck, this is a great way to deal with my opponent's artifacts because I just turned their soul ring into an artifact creature and then I can just very easily kill it with my creature removal, right? If I have a commander that is creature removal stapled on it, if I'm already doing that a lot in my deck, this is just an easy slot in where I'm already wiping out my opponent's creatures all the time. Why not throw a soul ring or an Akroma's Memorial or something into that as well? So that's why, again, a card like this, I like to commit to my deck building database because if I'm ever making a black deck that is, not in red or not in any color that really deals with artifacts really, really well, maybe a blue-black deck, something like that, but I can deal with creatures very easily, that's a card I like to find room for. Sometimes you just have cards that are outside the color pie a little bit, right? Like Jabari's Influence and Debt of Loyalty. I'll just throw these two out there. These are old favorites of mine. They are white spells that are gaining control of your opponent's creatures. For anyone who is looking for that kind of effect or just some fun, interesting things, sort of gotcha moments in a commander game, you're looking for white cards that want to gain control of creatures. This is 2 cards that do it. Jabari's Influence, 3 white, instant. Cast this spell only after combat. Very interesting wording there, but there's a reason why. Gain control of target non-artifact, non-black creature that attacked you this turn and put a -1/-0 counter on it. So your opponent attacks you with that big scary creature. You're gonna have to take the damage from it because of course you can only cast a spell after combat. That's why they have that wording there. But now you cast this and you get to gain control of it. Debt of Loyalty is a particularly interesting one. 1 white instant, regenerate target creature. You gain control of that creature if it regenerates this way. The reason why this is super interesting is because you can actually use this on your own creatures. Of course, gaining control of a creature you already control doesn't do anything, but you can just throw this in your deck as a way to protect your commander. Someone casts a Blasphemous Act. I Debt of Loyalty my own commander. It regenerates. I gain control of it, but that does nothing. Of course, I have just regenerated it so it survives the board wipe. That is an alternate way to use this card, but also a really funny way to use this card is that Blasphemous Act is getting cast. In response, I Debt of Loyalty my opponent's commander, and then when it dies, it gets regenerated, of course, so it doesn't actually die and I gain control of it. Just a really neat gotcha moment there. So again, these are other cards that just very unique in the colors, right? That's also a part of this. Not just mechanically what they're doing, but the colors they're in, right? Gastly Death Tyrant is a card that I have recently sort of committed to my database because it is very unique in what it's doing. 4 black, Beholder Skeleton, 6/5. When Gastly Death Tyrant enters the battlefield, choose 1. Creatures you control gain death touch until end of turn. That's not bad. Or destroy target enchantment an opponent controls. You lose life equal to its mana value. So this is just a mono black creature that is ETBing and straight up destroying target enchantment. That's very unique. Now, it's not entirely unique. You can just cast a Feed the Swarm, which is essentially doing what this creature is doing. However, in a black deck, there's some shenanigans we can get into, right? I'm not getting a lot of instants and sorceries out of my graveyard in a black deck. Getting creatures out of my graveyard is very, very easy, right? So yeah, you probably want that Feed to Swarm in your mono black deck. I would recommend it for sure, but you might also want to throw Gastly Death Tyrant in there. I say all the time, enchantments are some of the most powerful effects in the entire format, and black doesn't deal with them very well. And if I'm in sort of a reanimator strategy, this guy's a better option. Even though it costs 6, I can reuse it a couple of times, right? So that where it might be extra good. If I'm in a deck where maybe I'm in that Cedrus deck, right? That's not going to deal with enchantments very well. And I got that Auric Lore Mage in my deck because of course you absolutely have to have that in your Cedrus deck. Now I can go fetch my Gastly Death Tyrant because my opponent has a Heuristic Study, chuck it in my graveyard, and then I can unearth it, right? That's something I can't do with Feed the Swarm. So this is a sort of unique creature that I have now committed to memory because it is a black creature that has an ETB that destroys an enchantment. Target enchantment, right? That's very important. How about Dauntless Aan? This is an interesting card that I have committed to memory again a long time ago. And even though, again, it doesn't look like it's doing much, this is actually a very unique card. So 2 and a white, Bird Warrior 2/1 with flying. When Dauntless Aan attacks, untap target creature you control. Doesn't seem like much. However, this for me is really one of the best ways to untap a creature in white. Funny enough, it's not that easy if you don't want to pay the mana, right? This is a free way to untap a creature in white. And of course, because your Dauntless Aan has flying, all my opponents have flying blockers, I might be SOL, but that's not typically the case, right? It's very easy for me to just choose an opponent to attack that doesn't have a flying blocker, attack with this creature and untap a creature I control. And of course, there's a whole lot of commanders that probably want to be untapping in white. And for me, this is one of the best ways to do it. I mean, yeah, you can 1,000-year elixir, but that costs mana. A lot of ways cost mana, right? Most ways to untap a creature outside of blue, like blue does it really well, but outside of that, it actually starts to get a little difficult. And in white, you would be surprised. It's not that easy to be repeatedly untapping creatures. And this is one of the best ways to do it, right? This is a card that I have added to my deck building database because I'm in a white deck and I want to be untapping maybe my commander or other creatures all the time. This is a great option for doing so that doesn't cost any mana. Let's talk about Orca Squatters, another one of my old favorites that I love a lot. Again, just a very mechanically unique card in its color. 4 and a red, 2/3 Orc. When Orca Squatters attacks and isn't blocked, you may gain control of target land a defending player controls for as long as you control Orca Squatters. If you do, Orca Squatters assigns no combat damage this turn. Flavor-wise, I want to say fantastic. I also really like the Richard Kane Ferguson art. That's just me. Orca Squatters, right? If you know what a squatter is, it's someone who squats on land and doesn't want to leave. They're just taking that land. Hey, we were here first. It's now ours. I just love the flavor here. It's really funny. They attacked. They're not blocked. Now that land belongs to them. Sorry, too bad, so sad, it's mine. It is a red card that is stealing lands. Of course, destroying lands is super easy in red. That's the color that does it the best. But what if I want to take that Gaia's Cradle and I want it to be mine, right? I'm going to take your Cabal Coffers because, of course, the Urborg's already in play. So all I need is the Cabal Coffers, and now I can be adding all that black mana to my mana pool, right? Maybe I don't get it permanently, but I might get a couple uses out of it. So again, just another card that I've committed to memory that has a very unique effect. Again, speaking of stealing opponents' lands, Gauntlets of Chaos is another uniquely specific card that I have committed to memory for a very specific reason. So 5 mana artifact, pay 5, sacrifice Gauntlets of Chaos, exchange control of target artifact, creature, or land you control, and target permanent opponent controls that shares one of those types with it. If those permanents are exchanged this way, destroy all auras attached to them. So why is this card so important? It is a colorless way to either steal or exchange stuff with your opponents, right? Of course, certain colors, again, red, blue, do the stealing thing very well. Blue does the exchange thing very well. If you want to do that outside of the normal colors that do it, this is really your only option. Again, that's why I have committed this card to memory. I talked about this in the Yuumi, The Last Visitor Underwhelming Commanders video that I did, where I was doing a deck for that. And of course, it has legendary land walk. So if our opponent has a legendary land, our commander's unblockable. And for a 7/3, that's pretty important, right? But what if our opponent doesn't have a legendary land? Maybe we can donate one of our legendary lands to them, and Gauntlets of Chaos is the only way in mono green to do that. That's why that card is so important, because mechanically what it's doing in colorless is really, really important in the commander format. Maybe I want to donate a certain artifact or a certain creature or something like that to my opponents. I talked about Yukuro the Prisoner in a video about there's a commander that if it was in different colors, it would be way, way better, because there's this horrible downside. When it leaves the battlefield, sacrifice all non-ogre creatures you control. That's a horrible downside. But if you can donate to your opponents, that's a pretty great way to build around this commander, right? But of course, black doesn't do that really, really well. Gauntlets of Chaos is one of the ways you can do that, right? So that is why this card, I think, is really important when deck building a commander format, to keep that in the back of your mind. How about Renounce? Again, another card that I'm sure a lot of people have never even heard of before, but it is very unique in what it is doing. 1 and a white instant, sacrifice any number of permanents. You gain 2 life for each permanent sacrifice this way. So this can be a good card. I think, in a life gain deck where, I don't know, maybe someone's going to board wipe anyway. I respond by paying 2 mana, sacrificing all my creatures, getting a bunch of life. I mean, it's not bad. However, again, why this card is very, very unique, and what's the strategy you specifically want to put this in? I don't know. I can't think of any commanders or deck strategies off the top of my head that you'd want to do this. However, it is a white instant speed card. I mean, just a white card in general that is sacrificing any number of permanents. And in fact, anyone who's built a lot of decks will probably tell you any card in any color that is sacrificing any number of permanents is pretty rare. You don't see that very often. And of course, in white, this card is entirely unique. Now, of course, you're going to gain a bunch of life. That's great. But if for whatever reason you just want to be sacrificing a bunch of permanents, this is a great way to do it. I mean, I guess I could maybe throw this in my Danik deck, and I got a ton of clues lying around that I'm not going to pay the mana to draw the cards, and maybe life is more important to me now, so I could sacrifice a bunch of clues and gain a bunch of life. You know, I mean, I'm just trying to find a use for it. I guess I'm sacrificing a lot of creatures in that deck as well, so I could use it there. I mean, it might be a good fit. Where are you actually going to fit this? I'm not exactly sure, but again, this is a white card that can sacrifice any number of permanents, which can be very important in certain deck building strategies. So it's a good card to take note of. And I'm going to end off with Obsidian Fireart, a really unique card in a couple of different ways. And again, might be a card to take note of. 1 red, elemental 4/4. Pay 1 red, put a blaze counter on target land without a blaze counter on it. So I'm going to choose a land of my opponent's to put a blaze counter on. For as long as that land has a blaze counter on it, it has. At the beginning of your upkeep, this land deals 1 damage to you. So I'm picking my opponent's lands to put counters on, and at the beginning of their upkeep, that land is going to deal 1 damage to them. That is a very unique effect for sure, but not as unique as this reminder text, which is what makes this card really, really fun, I think. The land continues to burn after Obsidian Fireart has left the battlefield. I love that reminder text. It's great. Maybe the best reminder text on any Magic card ever, but of course what it means is after my Obsidian Fireart is gone, those counters on those lands, which your opponents are going to have a very hard time getting rid of unless they have a power conduit in play or something, or maybe they're playing a Chisei Heart of Oceans deck, something like that. Other than that though, those counters are going to stick around and they're going to continue to do them damage as the game goes on after your Obsidian Fireart has left the battlefield. Also fantastic art. I just love everything about this card. It's a little mana intensive. Where does this exactly fit? I don't know. Maybe in a deck where you want to be dealing your opponent non-combat damage. Hold on. Pretty sure they just spoiled a commander recently that is doing something like that. So we might be working out something here, right? If you're in any deck like that, if you're in any deck, I think that is doing the non-combat damage theme, this might be a neat fit, but it's doing something really, really unique and interesting. And that's why I'm giving it a mention on this video. There you go. A bunch of cards that for me are very mechanically unique, either in what they're doing or specifically in the color they are in. And for that reason, it's good to take mental notes of these cards for when you're deck building, right? I mean, maybe you aren't a huge deck builder necessarily, so you don't need to take note of all these cards, but you just happen to have a deck where I mentioned a card where, hey, that's a great fit, and now you can throw it in there because it is unique and you were looking for a card that did that thing. You didn't know that card existed and maybe you discovered it in this video, or maybe like me, you're a guy that builds like 5 commander decks a week, and so taking mental notes of all these cards for these specific strategies is really, really important. You guys let me know in the comments below if you know any other cards that are really mechanically unique in what they're doing, so it's important to take a mental note of them for deck building purposes in the commander format. And if you are thinking of possibly purchasing any of these cards, I do have a TCG player link. It's in the description below. Feel free to give it a click. It helps support the channel. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.